Thanks everyone for being here. My name is Ryan Owens. I am the interim director of the Center for the Study of Liberal Democracy. We're glad to have you here. We're glad to have everybody here who's on Zoom as well, zooming in. This is an important issue, and it's one that's before the United States Supreme Court right now. I have a few of my students here in the class and joining on Zoom. We've actually taken a deep dive into this case, and I think we're all pretty excited to learn a little bit more about it. So first off, thanking you. I want to thank our speakers, of course, who I'm going to introduce here momentarily. But I also want to say a quick word for our co-sponsors, the American Enterprise Institute, the executive council here. The student group has helped support this event. The Center for Research on the Wisconsin Economy, CROW, also supported this as co-sponsors. We're very, very appreciative of their support. We've also worked with the Fluno Center a number of times. Very happy to be with the Fluno Center again. So on October 31st, 2023, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in Students for Fair Admissions versus UNC and Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard. And the question in those cases, the questions are quite interesting. Whether the Supreme Court should overrule Grutter versus Bollinger, which we're going to hear a little bit about in a moment, and hold that institutions of higher education cannot use race as a factor in admissions. The court also looked at whether the 14th Amendment precludes states from taking race into consideration when making admissions decisions, and also whether Title VI of the Civil Rights Act is violated by penalizing Asian American applicants when the university engages in racial balancing, overemphasizing race, and rejecting workable race-neutral alternatives as stated by the petitioner's brief in the case. So we're gonna look today and ask, what were the arguments involved in this case? What evidence is there for and against the universities? And what can we expect from the court? I think most people who are observing this anticipate a ruling against Harvard and UNC. But I think one of the questions we want to ask and answer here is maybe on what grounds and how extensive might that decision reach. So we are fortunate enough to have three fantastic speakers with us. Peter, Arcidia, I knew I was going to do this. Arcidia Keno is here. He is the William Henry Glasson Distinguished Professor of Economics at Duke University. And he was the expert witness in the case against Harvard. So he's going to provide us with some of the data that was put forth in that case. David Bernstein is the university professor and executive director of the Liberty and Law Center at the Antonin Scalia Law School in Arlington, Virginia. Professor Bernstein is the author of Classified, The Untold Story of Racial Classifications in America. And last but certainly not least, Adam White, who is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He co-directs the C. Boyden Gray Center for the Study of the Administrative State, not the Center for the Administrative State, as he focuses on American constitutionalism, the Supreme Court, and the administrative state. The way we will proceed is the following. Each speaker will take roughly 15 minutes or so to speak, with some follow-up then from me. When we are done with that, we will move towards a question and answer section. So without further ado, I am going to bring Peter up, and I will get this screen up and ready for you to go here.
Great. You got a clicker for me?
All right.
Do you want me up there or here?
What's that? You can go wherever you want. That's fine. You can stay seated or. All right. Let's make sure. All right. You are ready to rock and roll with the clicker here.
Great.
There you go.
All right. Thanks for having me. I want to start by talking a little bit about why we have affirmative action in the first place to motivate what comes next. And there's obviously deep racial inequalities in the country, and one potential way of dealing with those things is to do something like affirmative action on the basis of race. What I'm showing here is how the educational inequalities have manifested themselves prior to college. And if you look at the share by race who get above a 1390 on the SAT. You see that the Black share is at 1%, the white share is at 8%, Hispanics are 2%, Asian Americans are at 20%. So it's sort of a 25%. Sorry, I can't even read my own graph. It's a pretty striking picture about what's happened in the education system prior to college and the different sorts of things that are happening at that point. So if you think about 1400 to 1600, that's going to be in the range of the Ivy League schools and so on. And if we did things based solely on test scores, you'd have a very skewed racial distribution. So in thinking about, there are plenty of reasons, arguments for affirmative action with regard to things like reparations for what's happened in the past, benefits of diversity, and those types of things. If the test score distribution looked a lot different, you wouldn't need to have those things. And it's important to keep in mind what the gaps look like when we think about what sort of affirmative action you would need in order to have a racially representative campus. So when we think about ways that you could respond to test score gap, one way would be to shift weight away from test scores to factors where the racial disparities are not as large. Okay, so actually, if you look in other countries, it's often you take one test and that test score determines whether or not you get in. The US is somewhat unique in this holistic admissions, and that's in part for some of the reasons with the test score issues. And then the other way is to give directive preferences on the basis of race. What I'm going to talk about today is taking the admissions criteria as given, not saying how the admissions criteria adjusts for race, but taking that criteria as given, how large racial preferences are. Now, prior to these students from varied admissions cases, I would say that we had an idea as to how affirmative action worked, but not a full understanding. And that's because, and I feel like that really misses what the debate should be about. So, we do all these polls regarding whether you're for affirmative action or against affirmative action. But what does that even mean? There's a large gap between using affirmative action as a tiebreaker and affirmative action as a quota. If you think about what sort of racial preferences you would need for that. And so understanding how large racial preferences are and whether we think it should be more or less should be a subject, of discussion. And the reason I think that we don't know how things work is that the Supreme Court actually, in their decisions in the Michigan cases, really gave huge incentives for schools to hide their data. So in Gratz versus Bollinger, they ruled that the explicit point system was unconstitutional. Okay, we can't just give you 20 points for your race or something like that. We have to use your race holistically. And that's what they got in the law school case. Now, from an economist perspective, holistic admissions is just a point system with an error tacked on at the end. But fundamentally, it can still represent it as a point system. It's just a point system where some things are unobserved. And we can recover how much weight are put on various factors by what's revealed in their admissions decisions. So the issue with this is, gets at the hiding the data. Here are two quotes from two of the more liberal justices at the time. So dissenting in Gratz versus Bollinger, you had Souter say, equal protection cannot become an exercise in which the winners are the ones who hide the ball. And then Ginsburg said, if honesty is the best policy, surely Michigan's accurately described, fully disclosed college affirmative action program is preferable to achieving similar numbers through winks, nods, and disguises. And I'm actually in complete agreement with that. If we're going to have affirmative action, I would much prefer the explicit point system where everybody knows what's going on to the one where it's the winks and nods. And I say that also in particular in light of something where we're in a very polarized society right now. And under the winks and nods system, what you can invariably get is the beneficiaries thinking that preferences maybe aren't as big as they are, and the non-beneficiaries thinking that they're much bigger than them. And that actually leads to more tension, than what we currently, than what you might get if we were just transparent about how things worked. So the next point I want to make is, well, when we do affirmative action, how does it actually work? And we haven't had the data to do this in my mind prior to the SFFA cases, but you can see the overall effects. And one of the key points, like you remember, is that affirmative action affects primarily where people go to college, not whether they go to college. So what I plotted on here is the average SAT score of college campuses. This data is a little old at this point, but the same patterns would hold for more recent data, and the share black of the student body. And you can actually see that it makes a U, right? So the top colleges here are actually more diverse than the next group. And when you get down to these lower average SAT score schools, these are places that are not selected. So it's really shifting. Most schools are not doing affirmative action because they're not selected. Okay, so it's not Harvard or bust. It's if I don't go to Harvard, I'm going to probably go to some other college. And also introduces a cascading effect where Harvard takes the students that would get in, based on their criteria without race, plus they take the next group. But then the next group is forced to, doesn't get those students that would have gotten in without race. They have to go to the next group. And so then that's how you end up with something like this U. So that's sort of a bit of the background. And it gets into why, my view, taking the case, somebody who studies this stuff, I wanted to know how things actually worked in these programs. So I got the chance to look at, applicant level data, 6 years of applicant level data for Harvard, and I was also expert witness in UNC, 6 years of applicant data for UNC. And to give you an idea as to sort of the context for this, over that period, the Harvard admit rate was 6.7%. And this really points to the issue of transparency. There are tons of people who are applying to Harvard who have no business applying to Harvard, right? Because they're not gonna get in. And once we went test score optional, those admit rates went down even further. Okay. UNC out of state, this is something I didn't really have a sense of before. I don't know what it's like in Wisconsin, but in North Carolina, there are restrictions on what fraction of the enrollees can be out of state. And you basically end up with two very different admission systems, right? One where the admission rate is under 17%, and the other one where it's over 50%. Okay. And affirmative action is actually going to work very differently in the out of state than in the in-state. You need to give me like a 1 minute warning so I don't go way over. So what we got to see is all the criteria that these admissions officers rated these applicants on, as well as test scores, grades, lots of measures of family backgrounds. And often I'm going to use something we call an academic index, which is a combination of test scores and grades, just as a summary measure of academic background. This academic index is something that's actually reported in the Harvard database, but based on that, I made up my own for the UNC one, just as a way of summarizing the data. So the first thing to note is that there are actually pretty big differences in how the applicants get scored at Harvard versus UNC. And so I actually see these Michigan cases as a handout to elite private schools, because elite private schools have the resources to invest a lot more into their process. So you can see all the extra stuff that Harvard has. Some of it's a bit bizarre. They have an athletic rating for all their applicants. The people who do best on that athletic rating are white legacies. And on UNC, it's much more limited. So UNC takes one letter of recommendation, but that letters don't get rated. UNC has a program and performance. Program is like, are you taking AP classes and such? Performance is basically, are you on a rise on your grades or a fall? So that's the first thing. This is your, what are the inputs into the scoring, into their scoring system? Now they're doing holistic admissions, so they record these scores and then they come to a decision based on those scores and all the other stuff in their file, including the race and legacy status and stuff like that. But if we just looked at what would have happened on the academic front, we can think about at Harvard, the share of each race. If we just looked at the people in the top decile, what is the share of each race? The top 10% in terms of academics, weighted combination of test scores and grades. What would that look like? Well, it'd be 57% Asian American. Okay. Harvard's admit rate is less than 10%. So, this, if we did it based solely on academics, well over half of Harvard's admits would be Asian American. Okay, so that's part of the reason why we have holistic admissions, is because these places want to look more racially representative in that regard. And then you can see it would be 1% African American. And this again points to the failures of our society happening before college, because if you look at the bottom decile, the share would be heavily African American. Now, part of the reason for this is Harvard actually encourages students to apply with different scores. So you're going to get a letter saying, hey, you should apply here. And the cutoff to get that letter is going to be much lower for African Americans than it would be for white or Asian American applicants. And oftentimes they're saying them to people who have no chance of getting in. I saw this with my own son. One of my sons got a letter from Yale saying, oh, based on your test scores, you should apply to Yale. I knew there's no way he's getting into Yale, right? I love my kid, but he was not going to get into Yale. Okay. If you don't have that information, then, you waste your time on that sort of stuff. So if things were based solely on academics, you can see what admissions would look like at Harvard, at UNC out of state, and UNC in-state versus what they actually are. These are sort of the shares of each racial group. So at Harvard, it'd be over 50% Asian American. The actuals less than half that. Okay, and then you can see for African Americans, 15.8 versus less than 1%. Okay, it could be. There's two ways to view those numbers, right? One is that why these academic stuff, test scores and grades, are irrelevant for what happens at Harvard, in which case you've got basically a racist criteria, and why are we bothering with that? But to the extent that these characteristics do matter for how you're going to do in college, in terms of what majors you're going to choose and so on, you're going to end up with student bodies that, while you have racial representation, the skew in terms of where they're distributed in terms of academic background are going to be very different. So at Duke, I teach intermediate microeconomics and I use multivariable calculus. If you haven't had calculus beforehand, it's going to be a tough go. I went to Willamette University where there was no calculus in the major. It's a very different experience. Okay, so it's running a little bit low on time here. I want to talk briefly. Obviously, Harvard considers things much more than just academics, and so does UNC. Oh, I also wanted to point out, look at UNC out of state versus UNC in state. You're going to get much differences between UNC out of state versus UNC in state. And that's in part because you got that 50% of applicants are getting in at UNC in state. It's much less selective than UNC out of state. So what we're going to do is we're going to estimate models of racial preferences. So take all that data and use their criteria. And when I say their criteria, what they reveal their criteria to be through their admissions decisions. And we're going to put all that in the model and see, how well can we predict their admissions? And we can do a great job of predicting the admission systems, particularly at UNC. Okay. So even though it's holistic, their decisions reveal the formulas. If we do that, the admissions, basically at Harvard, it quadruples the admit rate of typical African American applicants. So without racial preferences, it would be 2.25% would be the admit rate. With racial preferences, it's 9.5%. Okay. Now, if you thought about, obviously I was on one side, there was a Nobel Prize winning economist on the other side. What did he find? He found that it tripled the rate, admission rate. The primary difference here is that I'm looking at typical applicants. So these are not the athletes or the legacies or the children of donors. Their race doesn't matter as much, okay? If you are a Black athlete, you're getting in because of the athletic preference. Your race has nothing to do with that. So when you include those, then that changes things. For UNC out of state, it's actually much larger. So if you increase the admit rate by 11 times for UNC out of state African Americans, what's going on there? Well, there are two things. The first is that Harvard's already snagged a lot of the top scoring African Americans. So you have already a selected pool there. But the second is this the way UNC does these admissions is it actually splits the conservative argument against affirmative action in half. For UNC out of state, these people who are getting in, African Americans coming in from UNC out of state look like white admits in state. So they're getting much bigger preferences because of their race, but because affirmative actions, because admissions is so much more selective out of state, they're still much stronger academically than in-state African Americans. There's actually no concern. You can have it be this big, and there's no concern about their ability to do the work in the courses. They're going to be fine on the course side. So this is more about the fairness argument that conservatives will put forth on affirmative action. It's not fair that the preferences are so large. On the in-state side, the preferences are smaller, but this is where you worry about the being able to do the coursework, because now you don't, they're coming in behind the rest of the student body. And you can see sort of how that works together. And then the last point I want to make is that there's actually a lot of heterogeneity in how these preferences operate. You can see what is for Hispanics. Preferences for Hispanics have been a bit smaller than they are for African Americans. And then the other thing I want to point out is racial bumps are actually largest for advantaged African Americans. You get a large bump for being African American, you get a small bump for being disadvantaged. But if you're disadvantaged and you're African American, you don't get that disadvantage bump. Okay, that holds true both at Harvard and it holds true at UNC. At UNC happens through first generation college. First generation college, African Americans are the first generation college whites, smaller difference than non-first generation college African Americans and non-first generation college whites. Okay, and the same is going to be true. Basically, race gets treated much more like you're all the same. So, you know, again, you're not going to get the legacy bumps are much smaller for African Americans and Hispanics than they would be for whites, because you don't get the double bump. So I'll end there, just providing the context for what the case is about.
So, I'm the law professor, lawyer. I would say that you should be aware, as we discussed, that the standard for the constitutionality of affirmative action preferences in higher education is that they have to meet strict scrutiny, which means that the government has to show compelling interest, as the Supreme Court has thus far held that racial diversity in higher education is a compelling interest, and also the law has to be narrowly tailored to achieve that interest. And the narrow tailoring thing is something that the narrow tailoring thing, so this test for affirmative action being constitutional, there has to be a compelling interest. And the Supreme Court has held that racial diversity in higher education is a compelling interest, and that the policies have to be narrowly tailored to achieve that interest. So what does narrow tailoring mean? Well, in 2013, in the Fisher case, 7-justice majority held that they must verify, the university must verify that's necessary for a university to use race in admissions to achieve the benefits of diversity. And Justice Kennedy for the court wrote that the reviewing court must ultimately be satisfied that no workable race-neutral alternatives would produce the educational benefits of diversity. Now, 3 years later, that was applied relatively in a liberal way by the court in the Fisher follow-up case, but still remains the official standard. And this created a real problem for both UNC and for Harvard, because the Supreme Court first upheld affirmative action for diversity purposes in 1978. And like in Bakke, and like the vast majority of other universities, neither university really took any significant steps to see if they could achieve diversity without the preferences until they got sued, which doesn't look really good in court. So even though the court kept saying, we want you to do this, they never did. Harvard in particular, at oral argument, acknowledged that if they got rid of alumni preferences, athletic preferences, faculty preferences, certain sports preferences that are largely played by white kids, and they could achieve something approaching the same level of diversity without using race as a factor and without making a dramatic difference in the quality of their class. And Harvard's argument basically seems to come down to, well, we're Harvard, we shouldn't have to do that. What do you mean? Of course, you should just defer to us. And it's interesting because I don't think some of you are laughing at that argument, but you have to realize Harvard is Harvard, and traditionally the Supreme Court is very conservative with a small c, in the sense that it's graduate, like 8 of the 9 justices went to either Harvard or Yale Law School, and then went somewhere like Harvard undergrad. They have family connections, personal connections, professional connections, and that kind of argument really, I think, helped persuade Justice Powell, the swing vote in Bakke, and Justice O'Connor, the swing vote in Grutter, that we shouldn't really. How can we tell an institution like University of California or University of Michigan, much less Harvard, exactly how they should run their admissions? Now, so I think if we still had a different court, like say 10 years ago, I could imagine that the court would rule narrowly in this opinion that Harvard and UNC's admissions policies are unconstitutional. Diversity is still a compelling interest, but they just have to make more of an effort to show that they really have been exploring race-neutral alternatives, and that would just restart the process. They frankly do some sort of bogus study about it and then go on the merry way. So I think 3 things have happened in the meantime. First, the court has grown more conservative. Second, I think there's a sense among the justices that enough is enough. Ever since Bakke, we've actually told universities they're allowed to use race for diversity purposes, but they should do so narrowly. They should look for alternatives and so forth. And instead, basically every selective university is treating it like, as long as we don't formally and officially use a quota, we could do whatever they want. And I think the justices are getting impatient with that. Moreover, and this goes to my point about Harvard's prestige, Harvard ain't what it used to be in the eyes of the justices. The elite universities, which once would have had close ties to all the justices, are now hostile territory for conservative justices. Justice Kavanaugh was about the most establishment kind of appointee you could imagine. He had been George Bush's secretary in the Bush administration. He just a very establishment guy, sort of a moderate conservative Republican. And we all know what happened when he was nominated to the Supreme Court, but it wasn't that just happened publicly. The faculties of all these universities were sort of on board, and Kavanaugh was not quite fired from Harvard. I think it was clear that he wasn't welcome back to teach. So even someone like Kavanaugh, after basically teaching for free at Harvard, Harvard said, yeah, you're not welcome because of completely, basically unsubstantiated allegations against you from 35 years ago. The justices are not, I think, as inclined to defer to these elite universities as they used to be. In fact, to some extent, they may feel hostile. Certainly, the clerks who actually had to go to these law schools and be in the conservative minority and be mistreated by their classmates, often, as we just saw the incident at Stanford, are not inclined to encourage them to be sympathetic. Another interesting aspect of the arguments, is that the lawyers for both Harvard and UNC kept insisting that race isn't a dispositive factor. And the justices kept pushing them on this. And it really, I thought, was a terrible strategic move to keep saying that. Because by dispositive, they seem to me, well, it's not the only factor we use, but that's not what dispositive means in any sort of statistical or causal inference kind of thing. And it can't be. I mean, their position is correctly, as the data you saw just showed. And if you don't let us use race, the number of African American and to a lesser extent Hispanic admittees will plummet. Well, it can't be the case that you can't use race. Those numbers will plummet, but it's never dispositive. And I think that just was trying the justice's patience. In my own little niche area of research, of late at least, racial classifications, the oral arguments are very interesting because we've had affirmative action now in higher education for over 50 years, and the Supreme Court has endorsed it for over 45 years, and we have it in other contexts as well. But basically, until now, almost universally, the Supreme Court, and for that matter, lower courts, have taken the classifications themselves as a given, right? But if you think about it, we saw all this data about Asian Americans. I haven't done a deep dive into Asian students, but University of California at Berkeley helpfully puts data on their website about admissions for Asians broken down by subgroup. And it turns out, at least at University of California, when you're talking about Asians being dramatically overrepresented, quote unquote, at University of California, it's not Asians per se, it's mostly, more than anything, Indian Americans, who are, I did some rough calculations, represent about 14 times their number in the California population, then Chinese Americans about 5 times, then Japanese and Korean Americans like at 2 or 3 or 4 times, and then basically all the other Asian groups are more or less what you'd expect just based on their numbers. So Vietnamese, Cambodians, Pakistanis, and so forth aren't actually doing especially well. It's like, and then you think to yourself, well, what do these groups have in common? We have this Asian American classification, includes everyone from Pakistan to the Philippines, 65% of the world's population and origin, different religions, different cultures, don't look the same, don't have the same sociology, aren't really in lay terms or even anthropological terms, if you like to look at things as race, right? You have East Asians, you have Austronesians, and you have Caucasians, and not even that, but we just put them together in the same diversity classification. But this sort of thing has been more or less ignored until now. But at oral argument, there were some questions about this. One Justice Alito asked, why, if you're from Afghanistan and you apply, and Harvard says, oh, sorry, we have too many Asians, you say, a lot of these people, what does that have to do with me? Now, it turns out Afghans are really officially white, just to show you how arbitrary this is. Their cousins across the river in Pakistan are considered Asian, but nevertheless, the point still holds, right? What do these groups have in common for diversity purposes? Just asked, if you have the UNC lawyer, if you have an Arab-American applicant, what box does he check? The UNC lawyer claimed not to know the answer to that, which is weird because it's right on the common application that says, are you Hispanic? Yes, no. Are you white? If you check white, it says, are you European or Middle Eastern, including Arab-American? So I don't know if he was just lying that he didn't want to answer the question. So I think what Justice Kavanaugh was getting at is why Arab-Americans obviously could look different in complexion and otherwise than other white Americans. They are often Muslim and face discrimination for those reasons. Why are you treating them as generically white? And there was no answer given to that. And also Justice Kavanaugh asked a very interesting question, which is, would it be a racial classification subject to strict scrutiny or some other classification if we used descendants of American slaves as the category instead of African American / Black? Because all those statistics you just saw about Harvard, now they're pretty grim looking, but it turns out that 70% of the undergraduate Black / African American students at Harvard are either first or second generation African or Caribbean immigrants or have one white parent. So students who are actually descendants of slaves and whose ancestors lived through Jim Crow on both sides of their family, who the original impetus for affirmative action was to bring them into the economic mainstream, they're getting relatively meager benefits from these programs. So the interesting thing about the classifications issue, I already mentioned some of the anomalies. Once you open up that can of worms, it's hard to know where to stop before the whole thing unravels. Why is someone with a white grandparent from Spain in the same classification as someone from Guatemala? Why is someone from Guatemala who's 100% indigenous Guatemalan in the Latino Hispanic category with no real racial classification that fits them And someone who has a 1/8 or 1/16 American Indian background could put down Native American or American Indian, even though their name is John Smith, and you wouldn't know from their life that they were anything other than your standard Euro-American. Why do we consider a Hasidic Jew, or it's a big thing on Netflix with all these stories of Hasidic Jews who leave the community and try to build their lives in the secular world. So someone like that who decides to apply to Columbia, why are they in the same classification with someone who grew up in Appalachia? Like, what do these two people have in common if the goal is diversity? So it'll be very interesting, at least to me, since I wrote a short book about this, a classified book about whether the court actually does go down that road on the opinion and talk about the incoherence of the classifications. And by the way, the classifications themselves are purely based I mean, there are rules that you're supposed to follow. They aren't stated very explicitly, but they are based on self-identification. So you have these really weird anomalies where you could have someone who, for example, has 2 Mexican grandparents and 2 Chinese grandparents, and he has a twin brother. And one of them feels closer to the Mexican side of the family, so he puts down Mexican on his Harvard application, and he gets a preference. The other one feels closer to the Chinese part of the family, considers himself Chinese, so he puts down Asian, and he gets a detriment, even though they look exactly the same, grew up in the same household, and so forth, because the diversity preferences don't actually take into account like actual diversity in terms of what are your life experiences. It is purely a preference, as the lawyers admitted, based on whether you check the box or not. Go on. So that also raises another issue. I could go on and on about the classification stuff, or you can just read my book though. So I'll just go on. The other issue is that when affirmative action was started in universities in earnest in the 70s, the United States was really, not in, well, binary would be too strong a word, but about 85% of Americans were white, about 14% were about 12% were black, and then there was like 5% or so that were Hispanic, but they were generally considered to be white, and Asian Americans and Native Americans together were less than 1% of the population. So all the policies, all the Supreme Court decisions in the early years, and still in the public mind, it's all about whites versus blacks. And the idea is, whether, even if the diversity rationale is out there, there's still this underlying idea that whites have been the privileged group in the United States, and blacks have been the group that have suffered from state, private, violence, discrimination, and so forth. So we should bend over backwards to try to help Black people integrate into the mainstream. The problem, as we've seen in this data, is that, first of all, the people whose slots are being taken away are primarily Asian Americans whose ancestors did not have any, to the extent their ancestors were here, they also face severe racial discrimination, and most of them are actually post-1965 immigrants. In some contexts, like in the University of Texas litigation, Texas versus Fisher about a decade ago, it was mostly, since Texas doesn't have a huge Black population, there's a very large Hispanic population, it was mostly, if you had affirmative action, Hispanic students, mostly post-1965 immigrants, taking slots away from Asian American students who are also post-1965 immigrants. And the traditional Black-white thing really didn't come into play very much at all. Blacks did benefit, but they were only ultimately 6% of the Texas student body versus 20-something% for Hispanic Americans. And by the way, 18-year-old Hispanics are 25% of our 18-year-old population. So this is there are significantly more Hispanic applicants benefiting from affirmative action than Black applicants, although they do get generally a lower preference. So in any event, my best guess for the outcome of the case is that the court is going to overrule Bakke and Gruder and hold that racial preferences can no longer be justified under a diversity rationale. But where we go from there is an open question. Some universities will just give up preferences and say, look, we're just not going to do it anymore. We don't want to get in legal trouble, and maybe we're a state university, we don't want to get in trouble with our conservative state legislature. Some will cheat. California universities are all cheating, although they're not giving as much benefits as they were before Proposition 209 made it illegal. Everyone knows that California universities are cheating to some degree. And some will try to find substitutes for using race directly that they hope will pass legal muster. Descendants of American slaves is one possibility. Another would be I've seen many programs looking for my high school daughter for the summer. There are many programs out there that don't say they're interested in you based on your race, but they're interested in attracting people who have a commitment to diversity. In practice, then you look at the pictures, and everyone is either all black or black and looks like all Hispanic together. So they're using that as a proxy for race without using race, but it's actually worse in some ways than using race, because they're not just asking you to check the box, they're also asking you to show your commitment to the ideological underpinnings of our current diversity structure, which actually reduces ideological diversity. And finally, there are various sorts of plans, like some states have, to take the top 10% from every school, or to do more socioeconomic diversity, but to focus the socioeconomic diversity on zip codes which have high concentrations of poverty, which tend to be majority Black or Hispanic districts. And so we'll just have to see. Thank you.
Well, thanks everybody, and thanks especially Ryan to inviting me here. As Ryan knows, my wife is from Wisconsin. We spend a lot of time here with the kids every summer in Wisconsin. Wisconsin is our home away from home. We're here so much in the summers that my youngest daughter, when she was born early, she was born in Wisconsin. I call her my natural born badger. Speaking of which, beat Oregon. But anyway, I digress. Well, actually, one last thing about the forum. It's very nice to be invited to the Center for the Study of Liberal Democracy. As Ryan mentioned, I co-direct a program at the Scalia Law School called the Center for the Study of the Administrative State. Yours sounds more fun to study. The administrative state isn't exactly liberal or democratic now. And I'm going to get back to that a little bit because I think it's relevant to the topic for today. In light of the forum, the study not just of the court of this case of liberal democracy, I'm going to focus most of my remarks on some broader institutional questions that I think are either implicated or illustrated by these two cases and the broader controversies. I'll get to that in a moment, but let me just start with the cases themselves. I'll just say briefly, I do think, like David, and presumably like Peter, that the plaintiffs are going to win in both cases. Now, we shouldn't gloss over the differences between the two cases. There is a big difference between being a state university and being a private university. There's a difference between the text of the 14th Amendment and the text of the Civil Rights Act. We're going to take those differences seriously. The two cases might end up in the same place. I think they will. But there are at least marginal differences between the issues. For what it's worth, I think that the case against Harvard is, if anything, even stronger than the case against North Carolina, because I think the text of the Civil Rights Act, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, is even clearer than the text of the 14th Amendment. Where the Civil Rights Act, which of course is a much more recent law and in more contemporary terms, states flatly that people cannot be denied access to the benefits of or denied participation in a federally funded program on the basis or in light of discrimination on the basis of race. That's pretty straightforward. It's hard for me, I mean, famous last words, it's very hard for me to see how Harvard gets around that basic legal prohibition, the basic plain meaning of it, even before you get to the really awful record in the Harvard case about the sorts of things that administration or admissions officers were saying about Asian American applicants. I think that North Carolina will probably lose its case too, but to be candid, the 14th Amendment's, the original meaning of its text is a little bit more opaque. The history is much more complicated, and particularly in light of the Reconstruction era, post-Civil War efforts to give a kind of affirmative action to newly freed slaves and their families. We're going to take that history seriously. We shouldn't put too much weight on that 150-year-old practice, but we shouldn't shrug it off either. I'm very curious to see what the court's going to do with it. Frankly, when the Supreme Court decided its last major Civil Rights Act case, the Bostock case, involving gender identity and sexual orientation, as soon as I read Justice Gorsuch's majority opinion in that case, my reaction, which you could see if I hadn't quit Twitter and deleted all that a long time ago, you'd see my reaction the day after that case was decided was, we've just seen the majority opinion in the next race-based affirmative action case. I think it's impossible to see Justice Gorsuch's opinion as anything but a roadmap for a future application of the Civil Rights Act in other contexts. So again, I think that the court is going to declare pretty broad principles against race-based discrimination in this context. The real challenge is going to get in the details, and I'll get back to that in a moment. Oh, actually, one last thing on the case. We should group it in with a couple other major recent Supreme Court cases. The Dobbs case on abortion and the Heller case on the Second Amendment. And not just because they're controversial and closely watched cases, but because of the court's approach in both of those cases. The court has become increasingly comfortable in announcing broad principles in an initial case, and then allowing the admittedly difficult line drawing to follow in subsequent cases. We've seen that in the Second Amendment cases. We're going to see that in the abortion cases the next time that there's a case involving a right to abortion, in the case where the mother's life is in genuine danger. The court wasn't ignorant of that issue when it decided Dobbs, but it used Dobbs as the opportunity to announce the broad principle, and it'll return to the line drawing, the difficult line drawing later. Let me just say some words about the broader context of this case. When you take a step back and look at the affirmative action cases, they really do start to feel like the everything cases, because of all of the different fundamental social and political conflicts of our time, our case, in these cases, on race, education in America, and more than that. So I'm going to focus on three issues. One is the courts, two is modern administration, the administration, and then finally about the people themselves. And I'll just breeze through these, hopefully not too quickly, but pretty quickly. On the courts, the first challenge we see here is the basic challenge of the courts in applying precedent. And first trying to ascertain what a precedent actually means, or a bundle of precedents, and then trying to give due weight to it in good faith. This is one of those cases where it's hard to see who actually is standing up for precedent, right? I mean, as David said, and I agree, I think the court is going to walk away from the Bakke and Fisher and Grutter precedents. But it's not clear to me that the schools in this case haven't already walked away from those precedents for all the reasons that David illustrated in his remarks. The fact that it's hard to see who actually is living up to the restrictions in the Fisher case, or in the Grutter and Gratz cases, or, as David said, the warnings of the dissenters in the Grutter cases. It's not clear to me that anybody actually stands behind these precedents anymore. I think the justices will, in each of their own respective ways, try to give due weight to precedent, except for Justice Thomas, who doesn't have a whole lot of patience for precedent of any kind. But I think this case, more than maybe any other in recent memory, this pair of cases, shows us the challenge of applying precedent in good faith in this moment in time. So the second aspect of thinking about the courts in these cases is just the challenge of judicial remedies. And again, building on what Peter and David have said, it's very hard to see what the courts are actually going to do in subsequent cases once they've declared the broad principles, if they do rule against the universities, as I expect them to. We're going to have years of follow-up litigation trying to parse through whether a school's behavior is on the right or wrong side of the lines that the court draws in this first case. The third aspect of the courts in this case is about one justice in particular, Chief Justice Roberts. This is a fascinating case because I keep saying a case, a pair of cases, because in many ways I think it's going to help to debunk a narrative that arose around the Supreme Court at the end of the last term. At the end of the last term, of course, the Supreme Court overturned Roe. Only one justice on the court wanted to stop short of the Roe question. You had 8 other justices who disagreed fundamentally on the basic issue, but all 8 agreed that Chief Justice Roberts was wrong. Right? All of them wanted to go to the core question of Roe. Chief Justice Roberts has always wanted to unify the court. He seemed in Dobbs to succeed in unifying the court against him. And it was left, I think we left last term with the basic narrative that Chief Justice Roberts is irrelevant to the court. He's no longer really the chief. He's on the outs. That's a huge misreading of the last year. I looked at the numbers for an op-ed I published a while ago. Chief Justice Roberts was in the majority last term more than any other justice. Maybe I think he tied with Kavanaugh. Even more than that, he was in the majority more last term than any other term in his entire time on the Supreme Court, except for one other year. So he's in the majority more often than ever, more than any other justice on the court. He wrote not just unanimous opinions, but he wrote more 5-4 and 6-3 majority opinions than anybody else on the court. Chief Justice Roberts still remains at the center of the court, just not in that one case. And of course, it was a doozy case, the Dobbs case. But this year, I think we're going to see a rollback of that narrative, beginning with this pair of cases. Because after all, the entrenchment of racial divisions in law has been Chief Justice Roberts' major focuses in his time on the court. Over and over again, he's been among the court's most vocal and pointed critics of racial distinctions in law. And this, I think, these cases will bring Chief Justice Roberts back to the forefront of the court's work. One last aspect of the courts in all of this, and it might be the subtlest, but I think it's also the most important. It has to do with our polarization of our institutions. I'll just lead up to this point by saying, when you look at the other parts of our government, you see basically fights for, you see fights for control of institutions. Presidential elections, congressional elections, they have sort of a flavor of regime change in them, right? Your party's candidate for president loses a presidential election, and you just kind of bide your time and wait for the next presidential election when hopefully your party will swoop back in and take control of that institution. In the meantime, you feel like you're kind of in occupied territory. Same thing with Congress. There's been fascinating studies, especially by Francis Lee at Princeton, on how congressional behavior today really reflects the fact that most people in Congress and most of their advocates and their opponents just assume that control of Congress is at a knife's edge. It's just one election away, and you're just waiting to seize control of the institution. The courts are a little bit different. It seems unlikely you're going to have a wild change in control of the Supreme Court anytime soon. But the courts are similar to those other dynamics when you start looking at the judiciary as a whole. I think that progressives, to the extent that they don't see a path towards controlling the Supreme Court anytime soon, are going to put more and more weight on the closest thing they have to a home team in the federal judiciary. It's not really the federal courts of appeals, it's the federal trial courts. So where we're going with this, and what I think is really relevant to this case, is we're going to see in the next few years, I think, a really interesting divergence between trial court judges and Supreme Court justices. And you'll see trial court judges trying to convert more and more issues of law into issues of fact. Because of course, the factual findings of a district court are the things least susceptible to being overturned by appellate courts in the Supreme Court. And the affirmative action cases are a case study in that. When you look at the trial judge's decision, especially in the Harvard case, when you look at the litigator's strategies, especially in the Harvard case, you see a judge and lawyers trying very hard to put as much weight on factual findings as possible to try to lock in the courts of appeals and the Supreme Court. And the way that the Supreme Court grapples with that aspect of this case, I think is going to be a harbinger of future conflicts between the district courts and the Supreme Court. Just a few other points, quicker on these. I said I want to talk about the administrative state a bit. I mean, I run a center that studies it, so what am I going to do? To a man who only has a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But in this case, particularly with North Carolina, also Harvard, I think you see echoes of the debates we're having around modern administrative agencies. The schools in these cases act kind of like administrative agencies, not just because they're bureaucratic, not just because they have immense power over our day-to-day lives, especially those of us with kids growing up, but also their reasoning can often be very opaque. And you see a disjuncture between the way that the school agencies make up their minds on something and the way that they try to characterize their decisions and defend them in public. And by the way, you also see in these cases involving schools a dynamic similar to what I see in administrative law. One of the great ironies of studying administrative law is that the basic the basic political positions change. What I mean by that is supporters of administrative agencies really bristle under administrative law because that's the area where the regulators are being regulated. In administrative law, progressives tend to take a very libertarian approach. They want each agency to be free to choose how to live its own life without too many restrictions from the government on it. And you see very similar happening around the school admissions processes, where those who are usually most comfortable in using law and regulation to constrain choices are the most vocally opposed to seeing law and regulation weigh too heavily on this particular set of entities, institutions, and decision makers. Now, the upshot of that, though, is if I'm right that what's happening around schools is a lot similar to what's happening around administrative agencies, it means that the courts and the critics of the schools have their work cut out for them. Because when you study administrative law, when you teach administrative law, you see that administrative law and similar doctrines elsewhere are not well geared to peering into the minds of decision makers. Administrative law has tried to block that out as much as possible and judge agencies' actions in light of their written defenses. There's exceptions. We saw that in the case a few years ago when the Trump administration tried to add the citizenship question to the census. But you think of another case from the Trump administration, the travel ban case, where the Supreme Court made very clear they did not want to peer past the official record and really try to guess what was in the minds of the decision makers in formulating that executive order. We're going to see something very, very similar in years to come as the courts review the actions of state and private universities under what I expect to be the new law of university admissions. And then just briefest of all, I guess, I just want to say a few comments on the people themselves and the political response to these controversies. It's been fascinating to see how little the customers of universities have voted with their feet. And I know that all too well. My daughter's going off to college in the fall. She just completed her application process. She actually did tour UW-Madison when we were here last summer, and she loved it, notwithstanding the fact that I'm an Iowa Hawkeye. But one thing I know for sure is that for all the thought I've given to these issues of affirmative action, my wariness of a university's admissions policies had nothing to do with our decisions about where we hoped our daughter would go, where she wanted to go. We just had no interest in voting with our feet. And I'm not sure quite what to make of that, but I find it very, very interesting that even among those who tend to focus most, those of us who tend to focus most on market incentives and private ordering, have really either had no will or no opportunity to try to guide, to try to react to these policies with our own choices. I guess just in case it's not obvious from my remarks, these cases are so politically heated because they really do go to the most difficult issues of our time, and not just the debates we're having about race, but the debates we're having about education and a liberal democracy. We've had narratives about what universities are here to do, including narratives spun by those of us who work in universities. But the fact is, just like it's hard, evidently, to define the word woke, you guys saw that little kerfuffle on Twitter in the last couple of days. But it's very hard to define what's the university's role in liberal democracy in our own lives now. And for a while, we've tried to focus on meritocracy and metrics, but now that's become, from the university's perspective, untenable, particularly in light of, I think, the decisions that are about to be made by the Supreme Court. So we're going to have a real argument now over what universities are actually here to do. And the debates about race are going to dovetail with those arguments, and sometimes they'll be the tail on the dog. But I think, if anything, the decisions coming out of the Supreme Court are just going to amplify our anxiety about what it is that universities do in our lives today. So in closing, if the plaintiffs do prevail in the Supreme Court, we're going to enter not just the end of the debate, but I guess the beginning of the next phase of the debates. The court, I think, will declare pretty broad principles. And just like in Dobbs and in the Second Amendment cases, we're going to have real fights in the years ahead over what it all means in district courts and in administrative agencies. Weirdly enough, I think it could make the arguments not nicer, but uglier. I think we may look back on the arguments about the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act as the good old days, because I think the arguments ahead are going to be even more pointed and intractable. That's kind of a dark note to end on, but maybe I should stop before I make it any worse.
So thanks to each of you. I want to kind of pick up there where you left off, Adam, and I'll ask a couple of questions, and I'm going to open it up and see if folks here in the audience have some questions. But during oral argument in the I guess it was, well, it was probably the Harvard case. One of the attorneys conceded during that argument that if applicants to the university wanted to include in their written statement the efforts that they have undertaken to overcome discrimination, that would be appropriate to look at for university admissions folks. And I guess that concession to me seemed like it was really giving away the entire game. If it is permissible according to the students here to sort of talk about racial experiences and that suffices, why are we here? Right? I mean, what's the point of the case? And so I mean, anybody can grab this, but David, if you want to take the first crack at it.
Sure. So like I said, I mean, one what possibility is this, like I said, makes things worse because you say instead of looking at race per se, we're going to ask about people. You could even ask about specifically your commitment to diversity, which is then inviting you to talk about your own experiences. And then but then people who will do that will be people who are active in the diversity club, whatever it may be, and are committed to this stuff. But I guess beyond that, right? I mean, one of the issues, I mean, Harvard and UNC both claim that we don't only look at racial diversity. We care about religious diversity and ethnic diversity, but the university, the Supreme Court justice kept asking them, why do you only ask specifically about race and Hispanic ethnicity, and why do you only keep, like Harvard had a daily total that would go out to its admissions officers. Here's how many African Americans we've admitted so far. Here's how many have accepted. They try to keep on, not a quota, but they try to keep their goals in mind. So you couldn't do that. I think one step that the litigants will almost certainly make if they win, the next step will be to sue the Common App, if they could think of a standing theory, and say you're not allowed to ask the students to reveal their race. You will have, students will still be able to self-identify in their essays, just like my daughter wrote an essay about, one of her essays at least, about volunteering in her synagogue, because it was something that was important to her. So you can't stop people from writing about their experiences. And it is a problem, which I never thought of before, to bring this into the realm of like bureaucracy's view. It's very hard to know what's on bureaucracy's minds. And I think if universities want to cheat, that's one way they'll do it. The way to get around that, to litigate that cheating, but then bring in statisticians to show, economists to show, well, you're still obviously ultimately giving a preference that's based on race, because it can't be that Black students' experiences are that much more interesting than other students. But that requires, I don't know how much SFMA spent on this litigation, just your fees are probably a lot of money, I hope for your sake.
A lot less than Harvard.
I'm sure, yeah, spent a lot. Harvard spent like $30 million, I think. I have to give University of Michigan, where they defend the Gluter, and tens of millions of dollars. This is really expensive litigation. So one of the difficulties, I'd say, is that unless you act, the universities will probably, like, to the extent they want to cheat, will probably be able to do so, not as much as they are now, because for one thing, people who only have like vague ethnic ancestries who don't have anything to write about their experiences. Well, my great grandfather came from Mexico, but it doesn't really affect my life. They can make up something, I guess, but it's probably not going to be as interesting. In the absence, if you really want this stuff to be enforced, you need some combination of the Justice Department, state legal offices, and whistleblowers within the universities to be able to this is really good, cheating is going on. I don't see any prospect of that happening. But if I, for example, were a state legislator and I was interested in this issue, I might create some explicit qui tam action where you get a bounty if you work for one of these admissions offices, and you could show that you will reveal the emails or the private conversations that you recorded legally in your jurisdiction, showing that they were still trying to meet racial goals.
Boy, it's funny. I hadn't thought about that aspect. Your last point about outsourcing enforcement, not outsourcing, but leaning on whistleblowers and bounty hunters. For what it's worth, I don't think that's one of the better trends in government today. It's been a problem in environmental regulation. We've seen it now on the conservative side on abortion, where I'm very pro-life, but I wasn't a fan of Texas's approach to outsourcing. abortion regulation to bounty hunters. This would be another example I wouldn't like. But on Ryan's question about what happens if the schools pivot to focusing on overcoming racial adversity, that's really interesting to me. On the one hand, if it were about overcoming adversity in general, I think that would be great for universities to ask students. I think you can learn a lot from students, both in what they see as adversity and how they've overcome it. Young people today face any number of challenges to overcome. But even to the extent that schools would focus exclusively on overcoming racial adversity, that's not nothing. There is racism in society today. Some people face really, really ugly racism. And I don't think they should be shy about explaining how they've overcome that. But to the extent that the schools make that the end all be all, or the center of gravity of their admissions process, that's going to send a real political message, even different from what we're seeing today, where schools are focused at least nominally on diversity. If they really do explicitly put racial adversity at the center of their admissions process, it's going to raise real questions about what people think the universities are actually there for. I think to the extent the schools lean on that disproportionately their admissions process, I think it's going to send a real signal to state legislatures, especially with respect to state universities. It's been very, very interesting to see state legislatures become more curious about creating new institutions in their states. We saw this recently in North Carolina. We've seen it elsewhere. A few years ago in a magazine that David and I both write for, Commentary Magazine, I urged state legislatures to start thinking about education in terms of the new public option. We used to hear about that a lot on healthcare. I thought it would be great if state legislatures would get into the business of creating new institutions, new colleges to compete with the old ones. If you would just give the customers here, the people who want to send their kids to college, the people who want to go to college, if you gave them new alternatives that could actually compete head to head on the admissions process and in terms of the services that they provide to their audiences, that could have an interesting long-term effect. So I wouldn't like to see schools focus disproportionately on racial issues and on admissions. But in the long term, I think the new chapter of the debate could have some clarifying effects that might actually spur state legislatures to take some, that was a bad pun, I didn't mean it that way, affirmative steps.
So I guess I'm not as concerned about that. I think that if they are talking about overcoming that can be part of what happens there. I think that would definitely help with getting rid of the Asian American discrimination that I think is quite clear in the Harvard case. I think what implicitly happens the way it stands right now is with these categorizations, you're implicitly comparing people within a particular racial group. And so that's what happens to Asian Americans, for example. I will say that I think I have much bigger problems with things like diversity statements. And to the extent that it evolves into that, then I become more concerned. There's a really interesting paper by somebody who's on the job market this year from Yale about what happened in Chile. And what happened in Chile is they mandated that half of they have a proportional system, so it's proportional within the parties. Within each party, it had to be half female, half male. What was interesting about that is it ended up being affirmative action for women for the conservative parties and for men in the liberal parties. And it actually changed the way you think about what the parties actually look like, because more women were liberal and more men were conservative. And I think about that as being the opposite of the typical diversity statement, which is saying that we have to have this unified view in terms of how this works out. It would be great to see it, a Black conservative not be seen as a negative, but as bringing a different kind of diversity to the campus, so that you're not pigeonholed into having to play a particular role.
So one quick question for you, Peter, and then I want to open this up. So in the Harvard case, there's a sense that Harvard kind of wants to have its cake and eat it too. It wants to keep these legacy students, the athletic folks, donors' kids, that's a real big problem there. And your data seem to suggest that if they just knock those out and they open it up more broadly, that they would achieve the kind of diversity that they want in their student body. So Harvard on the one hand is saying, like, we really want diversity, we really want to open this up, but boy, we still got to keep these donors' kids and this other stuff. So they're not really putting their money where their mouth is on this. How do you think that's an accurate representation of where Harvard is? And I mean, just as you're reading this case, do you think this is something that the court will consider?
Yeah, if you got rid of those other preferences, that wouldn't get you to the racial diversity that Harvard wants, but it gets you moving in that direction. Certainly, I found the stuff on athletes in particular to be pretty stunning at Harvard. I think everyone would have more perception that legacy preferences are the real bad ones. The difference with the athletic preferences is that they're way bigger. And when you think about athletic preferences, you think about them being a bit of an equalizer. And that's just not true at Harvard. At Harvard, they offer more varsity sports than any school in the country. And the marginal sport is a sport like sailing. So if you actually got rid of athletic preferences, whites would go down, African Americans would stay the same, and then Hispanics and Asians would go up. Now, if you took away, if you went to revenue generating sports, then we're going to keep those and get rid of the other ones, then it would be only whites would go down. And those preferences are humongous. So your ticket to Harvard is to be on the same.
Can I say something about the diversity issue? I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but could I just disagree with people on
Real
this?
quick, go ahead.
One of the really regretful aspects of this entire debate over the years on these issues is that we shouldn't undervalue the importance of diversity at universities, all forms of diversity, racial diversity included. But if liberal education is here to teach us how to live in a society with one another in a self-governing democracy, one of the great virtues of the universities is to bring us together with people who aren't like us. And I really hope we don't get away from that. And furthermore, I don't think I'm disagreeing with Peter, my comment's a little orthogonal to his, but to the extent that university admissions do get boiled down into just a couple of metrics, I think that's a really deforming trend in education. We're not just a couple of numbers, we're not just a couple of test scores. I do think it's good that admissions offices would look at the whole student and try to build diversity into their student body. And to the extent that we and some issues like race, again, they bump up to the 14th Amendment of the Civil Rights Act. There are limits on what the universities can do, but I hope we don't go all towards metrics. I don't think we will, but to the extent that that's the debate on my side, the right, I think it's a big mistake.
If I could also add, I'm sorry. I want to say, having been in academia since I was in college with a very short break before I became a professor, I will say bluntly that actual concern for diversity is not what is driving university affirmative action programs. University faculty, administrators, and so forth, faculty or the ideologues among them believe that we need to redress historical exclusion of African Americans. Hispanics could come in with that too. That's not the important aspect. It's the historical treatment of African Americans is the issue. And for the ones who aren't ideological, they just feel like we're Harvard University. We can't politically go out there to donors, to politicians, to parents with a school that's 0.9% African American, as the data would show. That would be not politically viable. And that's what's driving it. This is actually, so they may be concerned about diversity. They want people from different parts of the country, religions. But as far as like the real preferences go, that is driven by historical redress of historical wrongs and the need to make sure the elite universities have African American representation. And that is the driver. That's also illegal under current precedent, so they can't say it. Which is why I found, by the way, Justice Kavanaugh's question about descendants of American slaves so interesting, because that is a potential compromise where you say, okay, we're just going to call that a non-racial category subject to very narrow, almost no scrutiny. You could do that, but you can't go look at race beyond that. And that would allow you to have 8 or 10% African Americans who are actually fit that criteria without, say, we have too many Asians or not enough Hispanics or too many whites or whatever the other racial categories might be.
All right, so I want to open this up to see if anybody has any questions here. We've got 3 experts on this issue. We'd love to have thoughts, comments, questions from anybody here in the audience. Yes, Representative Murphy.
Thank you, Ryan. Peter, early on in your presentation, you talked about large bumps and small bumps in the admissions process based on different criteria. You have to know what the criteria is to know whether you're having large bumps or small bumps. And so the reason I'm asking the question, as the chair of the meeting, I have asked for and tried to get the admissions process. And get it. And they come up on the it's one of the criteria was so I speak to that a little bit, and because you're in a court case, I'm assuming you got to see all the admissions policy of UNC and Harvard.
Yeah, so I guess I'm a big fan of revealed preference as opposed to what they say, because I'm sure that what they say doesn't actually line up with what actually happens. And so you get the revealed preference through who they actually admit. Now, my complaint against universities as a whole is the fact that they typically hide their data. I think at Wisconsin, they've been able to get better access to getting the data to find out how to help students succeed. Well, even when you think about, well, what's revealed in terms of how much weight they're putting on different characteristics, it does get at why. You know, they must be thinking that it's associated with some long-term outcomes. Well, why not actually use the data to relate it to those long-term outcomes, as opposed to saying, well, we sort of hope that the personal rating means that we're getting nice people. You know, we don't actually have any metrics for any of this. And the irony is, I mean, I'm at a place at Duke where we house all the North Carolina public school data, and tons of research papers get written with that data. Yet you can't use Duke's data to help the Duke students. Universities are Luddites with regard to their data typically. And it's ridiculous. We should be using the data to help the students and to identify a lot of my issues with affirmative action could be addressed if we actually use the data to help their students. You know, there's no scope for mismatch if we can use that data to help their students. So what they say, all that to say, what they say about what their policies are, I don't put any stock in it. Well, so the argument is that once you know what the formula is, then you get a college consultant to help you game that formula. And this is actually where I'm actually very much for the strict point system, because you can talk about how test scores are unfair and so on, and they are, you know, they do favor the rich. But the reality is the other stuff favors the rich even more, you know? And so we can, the trade secret argument is if I know how I can game the system by saying all the right words, that's where it becomes problematic. And that's why I like the just here. It's very simple. You do run this test and we'll take you take the test once, because you take it multiple times, that favors certain groups disproportionately too. And yeah, it's not perfect. It's far from perfect, but I think that the other stuff, particularly after reading the Harvard case stuff, I don't view that as a model policy at all. You know, I find it slimy.
There's a professor at UCLA, Rick Sander, who's been doing work on mismatch in law schools, and he's been trying to get the data, which you think both anyone would want to know. How, if you take people with certain scores, how well do they do in law school, and do they pass the bar? You would think that even the strongest proponent of affirmative action wouldn't want kids to be admitted, spend 3 years of their life and $150,000 and never become a lawyer. But once he started doing this research, all the sources and wrote about it, every source he had dried up, and every law school, university, state bar system has been fighting him tooth and nail not to give him any data. So the transparency is not only bad because we don't know what to do with the scores and how to help the students, but also if you're a student, wouldn't you want to know? If I'm an African-American student and I'm getting a preference to get to the University of Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin's median LSAT is 163, and I have a 154. I want to know, well, do kids with 154 tend to pass their classes? Do they pass the bar? If not, maybe I'll go somewhere else. I don't want to go to a more prestigious school and never become a lawyer.
I think you could definitely see that. If you look at what happened in California where they banned racial preferences, you see this movement, a little bit down-weighting tests and up-weighting high school grades, which, and then you see it in, they actually end up putting more weight on being low income. And so there are these shifts in what they're doing, and they probably might come up with other measures along those ends too. So, you know, I think if you want a little bit of affirmative action, you should ban affirmative action because they're going to figure out ways to make it work. But the targeting works very differently then, because if we put more weight on lower income, that actually hits poor Black students who actually are not getting the largest racial preferences at these schools. So the real losers in the Prop 209, when that went into effect, were rich Black students. Not the poor ones. They lost too, but not near as much.
Yeah.
I would love to hear what as you said, this is the university president, maybe who made those comments. Am I hearing that correctly? And one of the challenges for the universities is to be both, they're trying to be both egalitarian on this issue, but also be elite. And it's sort of strange when you take a step back. It's one thing to talk about Harvard in those terms. We're talking about land grant universities that were created for the purpose, like the lower R Republican purpose of bringing people from the middle class, the lower middle class, people from outside of sort of elite, elite communities, and giving them a path to middle class prosperity and like a flourishing life. The extent to which it's not clear that universities stand for that as much anymore, because they are so focused on trying to, on the one hand, be egalitarian in some ways, but at the end of the day, be elite universities, elite top tier research universities. It's the university presidents and their leadership have basically put themselves on the horns of a dilemma. And I'll be very curious, again, they're trying to think through what the post Harvard and UNC case world looks like. To what extent will any of the state universities really try to recommit themselves to that purpose of bringing people up from the lower parts of our society, educating them and giving them a chance to thrive on their own terms? And again, I'm not sitting here denying that there isn't a lot of discrimination, including racial discrimination in our world. There is, and I think the universities have a real role to play in helping bring people back up from the lower parts of society. But it's about more than just race. But to the extent that they want, first and foremost, to be elite universities who can then also sell themselves as diverse, they're never going to get past that dilemma. And I think they're going to keep wrapping themselves around in pretzels, trying to accomplish both things, or at least being seen as accomplishing both things. I wish they would just be true to their roots.
To slightly elaborate on that, I've told people, I've said speeches before that one reason universities are so committed, elite universities are so committed to racial diversity is that what they're actually doing for the most part, with most of the students they admit, is what the left calls reproducing hierarchy. because most of the students they take in, like at the oral argument, the former Solicitor General said, well, for Harvard, well, you know, almost half of our students get financial aid. Well, that means that over 50% of the students at Harvard could afford $85,000 a year out of pocket, right? So they're reproducing hierarchy, if you want to use that term, but they say, oh, but we have a lot of minorities, so you see we're being egalitarian, but they're really not.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I want to follow up with a point that you made, Adam, and I think Jason, the point that you raised too. So in one of my classes this semester, we actually focused on this particular case, and the students talked a little bit about socioeconomic status, and whether that's something we should look at. And you know, I asked my students, I said, you know, how many of you have parents who were blue collar workers? Okay, not a hand went up. You know, how many of you were friends with somebody whose parents were welders or plumbers or carpenters? And not a hand went up. And I think you're right. We have universities right now that are preaching a lot of notions about, you know, acceptance of people and helping the little guy. And yet it's just people preaching to the choir on this. I really do think that we could do a lot more to help bring people up with our universities today than we're doing right now. Question. Yep.
Really a point of distinction around that. And there's a lot of research that that's not an indicator of that. We just had a conversation around courses in terms of, so how do you reconcile? Because it appears that that's not right. That's the way in which we're trying to decide you should get in, when evidence, right, is telling us that that's not a good indicator. So how do you address that?
Yeah, so I think that it's not a good indicator for some things, but is a good indicator for others. So if you want to do one of the sciences or economics, then your SAT math score is actually very predictive of how you're going to do. But for other majors, it's the high school grades that matter a lot more. And so, you know, tailoring, you know, if the test score isn't doing anything, it's just disproportionately hurting particular groups, so we shouldn't be using something like that. But that's again a case where I think that the data really matters, and linking it to the outcomes, you know, what's going to lead to success is so important. And I think we have some ideas of it.
The assumption, right?
Yeah.
That means you have to really get an understanding. So then it appears that there's a pushback. And in this case, we're talking about race as an element, but there are other things that you look at or but it appears like there's some pushback on that. You know that test score, the indicator of the but
Yeah, I think that just tried to show the, you know, the gaps. To me, it wasn't. I viewed that as we need to fix things at an earlier stage. It's not to say we shouldn't be doing things at the later stage, but I think we miss out. I think Roland Fryer's got some great work on how to improve the gaps that are happening prior to college. But you're right that there are many other metrics, and that one's one of the starkest for sure.
So, you know, if we're concerned about bias, right, we see in those are the areas that historically have probably been the most biased areas in terms of admissions, you know, even before we talk about integration. Yet that's not an issue that's causing bias, right? And so it feels like we're positioning ourselves for what might be good for certain groups versus others, rather than say, hey, we need to think about this from the next step. Right? Are we looking at everybody in terms of their best life, right? But we quickly kind of brush past things, and I wonder why even the court didn't dig in that deeper, did it?
Yeah, so I think, you know, I've written 5 papers out of the Harvard case so far, and the first 2 are actually all about legacies and athletes. I think the focus here is because legacy is not a protected class. But I am completely with you that in my mind, there are benefits to legacy preferences, but to me, they're seriously outweighed by the costs. And the costs are lack of trust in the system and the fact that, it works to favor, very privileged groups. So, and I think the same holds with athletics, depending upon what sports we're talking about. If the sport's not offered at a public school, why should that be sort of an automatic admission?
But I think in that conversation with really indicated race within those groups, right? There are people who are better in those states, right? That you can see there's a trend, right? And so race is playing a role in there, but not in a way that we kind of see. Race is covering there, but they're seeing a difference in terms of how groups are being treated, even with the.
Oh, so yeah, so they basically, my read on what we saw in the Harvard case is that they treat non-white groups much more the same, regardless of their status. So when you think about moving a white applicant from being a non-legacy to a legacy, they're going to get a much bigger jump in their admissions probability than moving a black applicant from a non-legacy to a legacy. And they did the same thing with on the poor side, that if you move white applicants from not disadvantaged to disadvantaged, you get a bump. But if you were black, you weren't going to get non-disadvantaged to disadvantaged, and you're not getting it because they tend to treat all black applicants unidimensionally in that regard.
And that was the thing about this case that struck me as odd. I asked a little bit about that earlier, is that Harvard wants to benefit like 4 different groups, right? The children of academic staff and faculty, athletics, legacy students, and students of donors. And if they just omitted those 4 groups, they would have a lot more room to do what they want to enhance diversity. And the fact that they're not doing that right now, I think shows that they're not really serious about these efforts that they purport to be serious about. Is that how you guys read the exchange and oral argument?
Oh, I mean, it was abundantly, like I said, the Supreme Court keeps saying, we're going to let you do this, but you really have to consider race neutral alternatives first, and you have to try to fund non-racial alternatives. It's not that they even considered them and rejected it. They just completely ignored that entirely. Their read on the cases, what their outside counsel, their general counsel are telling them is like, look, the odds of you getting sued are very slim unless you use an explicit quota. So don't change anything. Just don't call the quotas. You don't have to worry about your legacy preferences and this and that. And I should say, at Harvard, you have to understand, is probably the most sophisticated possible defendant you could get, right? In the sense that they're Harvard, so they knew that they might be a target. So their emails will be less revealing because I'm sure they're much more concerned. I think if SFA had sued, some good but not very top university, it would have been even more. You probably would have just found emails just saying, "We're not. Who cares what the opinion says? Just go full steam ahead." Because Harvard, and UNC is a state institution, they knew that their emails were subject to FOIA, so they have to be careful. And Harvard knows they're a target. And I always would wonder what goes on in the admissions offices at schools that weren't really worried about being sued.
But Gorsuch kept coming back to that point on the squash players.
Yeah.
Why do we?
When I was looking at private schools, which we didn't ultimately send my daughter to, they all had like lacrosse team and all this stuff, and they required the kids to be on a sports team. Well, why? And then someone explained to me, you have to understand, people are spending $40,000-$50,000 a year. They want their kid to go to a top school. If their grades aren't good enough, they need to have a lacrosse team, a golf team, a sailing team, so they can get it on that basis.
Yeah, I mean, I am one of the least athletic people out there, and I got cut from my 5th grade basketball team. My kids played on the soccer team at their private school because they don't cut anybody, and that's that feeds into Harvard's athletic rating. You know, those opportunities are there in ways that really, that comes back to my test score point.
And if I just say, I wanted to, if you don't mind, I want to return to the point about legacies in sports. And again, to my point that I worry about making university admissions exclusively about numbers. I think I don't want university admissions to be disproportionately geared towards rich donors and legacies and athletes, but there has to be some space for that, right? It's good to have some people who are committing their own resources to the university. Yeah, they get a benefit, but the university gets a benefit as a whole. It's good to have families that are proud that they've been multiple generations at a university, that they're a little bit more invested in that university than the folks who haven't yet had the opportunity to have multi-generation. But I think it's good to have some people who really invest themselves across generations in a school. And same with sports. You know, I wasn't a great athlete to say the least, but especially at big universities, it's wonderful to see the community rally around sports teams. I mean, here, famously so, again, I'm a University of Iowa guy. It's not a coincidence that my son is named Hayden. And if you watched Big Ten football in the 1980s and 90s, you'd know who Hayden was in Iowa. That these are a great way to build university cohesion in a community cohesion in a university. And I really worry that the fights over racial distinctions in the law are going to bring us to a place where you can't look at those things, you can't look at broader diversity, and even be cognizant of racial issues too. It gets really tricky with the Civil Rights Act and the 14th Amendment, but I'm not saying that there shouldn't be some space for admissions officers to look at the applicant as a whole and to try to build a truly diverse community. And I really worry that the response to the emergence of race distinctions in admissions has brought us to a place where we're saying no more of anything but test scores, because I think the universities would look very different and they'd lack a lot of the things that are best about them.
All right, we got time for one more question. Yes, ma'am.
And I guess my attended today, I want to clarity on the limitations for the work forward in light of visuals. So, like I said, some of the determining criteria for our scholarship is state, and a lot of our funding, our program in particular, comes directly from the university funded public funds. So I'm just curious if you can understand better if important people have implications for the scholarship demographic that we serve. Are we then going to have to shift our practices? We are able to do it. And just, I guess it's a setting of precedent for changes in the way that student supports are offered and in particular scholarships are offered that, you know, not only addresses the fact that students coming from underrepresented backgrounds being admitted, but also that protection piece. A lot of the work that I do that's amazing is making sure that the students who are coming from low income backgrounds, who are Black, who are other like Native students, that they also have something to count for them and giving them that support, since they might not have that same connection and that same amount of support from other so if you can respond.
So I'll jump in first to give the panelists some time to think on how to answer. Oh, no, that's a great question. Thank you, Emma. I would just say a lot of this is going to depend on how the court writes this decision. You know, I think there are clearly at least 5 votes here against Harvard and probably against UNC, although that's not quite as clear. But the question is just going to be how that opinion gets written. We may wind up with a fractured court on this. There could be 3 conservative justices who want to say no race ever, and another 3 who say, well, it can be taken into consideration in some respects and not in other respects. And you have 3 justices who say it can always be. And if we have that kind of a fractured court, boy, we're in for a whole heap of trouble. So I think the short answer of it is just going to be how the court writes this. And now I'm happy to defer to smarter people than
So
myself.
one thing I've been wanting to mention for a while, but I haven't gotten to, is that we have to understand that legal decisions are not self-enforcing. So two related points. First of all, in 1988 and 1991, in cases called Croson and Adirondack, the Supreme Court issued rulings that I think everyone at the time thought was ending race-based preferences in state and federal contracting, which go to all members of official minority groups. They left a very narrow, what they thought was a very narrow possibility for situations in which there's proven historical discrimination in government contracting, and that discrimination continues today. And that's a hard standard to meet. No one had bothered to do that before they started these programs, and people sued after Croson and Adirondack, that everything was declared unconstitutional. Almost every single jurisdiction in which their law was declared unconstitutional then reenacted the laws after hiring a consulting company to find, and they always found, that there was historical discrimination that was still manifesting itself currently. And the only thing that wound up happening to state and federal construction preferences is it made a lot of jobs for economics consultants and historical consultants who are willing to find the answers that the governments wanted to justify their programs. So even though we have programs that if you read the opinions, you think, oh, you can't have contracting law. Every jurisdiction still has, including the federal government. Similarly, look, when I was looking, I said my daughter's in high school looking for programs for her for the summer. There's an amazing amount of programs sponsored by universities around the country, summer programs, virtual programs that are for women or actually girls only. This is clearly illegal under Title IX. There's no question about it. You can't have a program that entirely excludes men from it. There's no possible legal justification under Title IX. And whenever these things get challenged, they always go away. But they're doing it anyway, and until someone bothers suing or challenging it. So my first answer to the question is, if the university general counsel or the state attorney general doesn't order the university to go through all its programs and decide whether they meet the Supreme Court's opinion or not, a lot of these will just continue regardless until someone complains about it, if then. The second thing I would say is that it's probably illegal right now to have to say we prefer people of color and other unspecified individuals for these programs, and no one ever bothers challenging them because there's actually much more low-hanging fruit of programs that do say only people of color, which again are more clearly illegal. So there's limited resources. To challenge these things. They just go on. The third thing, though, to get to the question, at least technically speaking, is if the Supreme Court does say they're no longer allowed to use race in admissions, it would surely be applied to scholarship programs as well. And you would have to find some other way of trying to reach the same constituents. One way would be that we have a program for schools that where students are coming from with high rates of poverty. I think it might even be constitutional to say that we have a program for students who come from areas of high rates of poverty and racially segregated schools.
Can I, Emma, you're raising all the right questions. Like Ryan says, so much of it's going to depend on what the majority opinion says really precisely, even assuming that there is a majority opinion. But just thinking through this as a former lawyer, my first question I would ask is for your institution, what is its formal connection either to federal funding, which is the hook for the Harvard case, Civil Rights Act, or your connection to the university here? Because again, like UNC, that's about a case of a state university as a state actor. To the extent that you're getting resources from the university, funding from the university, but you are independent from the university, if you have, maybe I don't know what it is, it's a nonprofit,
501c3.
So you're actually a unit of the school, then yeah, you're going to be knitted really closely to the upshot of the UNC case. I'd still read the opinion closely, but I just want to be clear here. Not all scholarship programs are the same, right? Some are going to be C3s, or they wouldn't be C3, but they've been nonprofit, separately incorporated that gets funding and allocates it. But it's to the second thing that you raised is that to some extent you're looking squarely at race, to some extent you're looking at underrepresented communities more broadly. And to the Supreme Court at oral argument really grappled with, as we said earlier, the extent to which race is dispositive in a decision. What does that mean? What does it mean in theory? What does it mean in practice? How could race be taken into consideration, yet not be sort of the final decision criterion? And the court is gonna, like I said, they'll leave a lot of that for subsequent litigation, but they're not gonna be able to leave all of it for subsequent litigation. They're gonna have to give some signals about to what extent race can come into play or correlate with other factors that are coming into play without being totally taken off the table. And they'll probably also have to send some signals about how the courts should read the intentions of institutions. If they're looking at things that aren't necessarily, they say, we're looking at these factors, it's not just about race, but it correlates in the end closely with race, the courts will probably be more skeptical of that, but they're never going to know precisely what's going on in the minds of the decision makers. What I just said might sound like a roadmap for evading a Supreme Court decision. I don't mean it that way at all. Like I'm genuinely not. I don't mean it that way at all. It's an appeal to the good faith of everybody in this to take the court's decision seriously, try to honor it, do it, try to obey it because it's going to be the law one way or another. But to know that these things are not going to be totally settled after this first pair of cases.
But they become settled when other people sue and such. And
Yeah.
there, I think that people generally don't have the next lawsuits. I don't think are going to be over programs like yours. I think the next lawsuits will be did they follow the admissions stuff again? I think people find the admissions stuff to be much more controversial than scholarships.
And that's what happened with Brown versus Board of Education. You think the most cut and dry Supreme Court decision, no schools can't discriminate on the basis of race. It took a long time for the courts and schools to grapple with what that meant. And partly that was a story of institutions in good faith really trying to grapple with this. It was partly a story of institutions in bad faith trying to evade the Supreme Court's Brown decision. But for both stories, it was one that took a lot of time and follow up, not just in the courts, but in other institutions, Congress and other legislatures, among others.
Well, speaking of time, we are out of it. I want to thank everybody for being here. I will say I'm going to conclude right now. David has to catch a flight. So as soon as I shut up, he's going to bolt out of here. Please do not take any offense to his decision to leave and bypass you very quickly. But I want to thank all of our speakers for being here. Adam, David, Peter, the expertise that they brought to this is fantastic. I want to thank you all for being here. The Center for Research on the Wisconsin Economy, the American Enterprise Institute Executive Council here at UW-Madison, and thanks for their support. Everybody who's watching on Zoom, thank you for your time. It's a fantastic thing here. We all believe in higher education, and we all want to get us to a better place with higher education. And I'm very pleased with the fact that we're all able to come together and talk about a very touchy subject in a way that's responsible, I think shows the Wisconsin way here. So thanks everybody for being here. Thank you to our speakers, and thanks everybody for watching on Zoom.
Thank you so much for having me.